Hello everybody, it's Hater, and for a while now, Chaos Reach has been a bottom of the barrel super. Ever since its reign of terror in Season 14 with a certain pair of squeaky boots, it honestly just hasn't been the same. But you know, as per Bungie usual, they have other plans in mind for it, because with Season of the Witch releasing, so did a whole new set of sandbox changes. Some, of course, being vastly overpowered than others. However, one of the changes I wanted to highlight with you guys in today's build video is the one to the aforementioned squeaky boots, Geomag stabilizers, because with them we're going to be making Chaos Reach a top tier super again, farming close to 30-second supers, and have borderline infinite abilities from all of the ionic traces we're going to be able to create. But as always though, before we get into it, if you guys want to see more content like this in the future, then the best way to show support to the channel is by giving the video a like and subscribing so you'll never miss out on a brand new build video. Everything in this build starts with Geomag stabilizers and its new updated exotic perk, where besides extending our Chaos Reach as long as we're hitting things, it's now going to cause ionic traces we pick up to give us 2% of our super alongside everything else ionic traces already give. This singular line of text is what we're going to be focusing the entire build around. Think of it much like the Fallen Sunstar build from previous seasons. We're going to create as many ionic traces as possible so we can feed them right back into our abilities. Except this time it's going to involve our super. Speaking of which, Chaos Reach may still not be one of the best one and done supers, but it is heavily carried by Geomag stabilizers. And since it was lost to time to the Seal of Orichalcos,
it should have been me, not him!
It did receive two major buffs to both its damage output via these periodic lightning strikes and overall cooldown speed to now a tier 2 super. Now just for having the boots equipped, we can effectively increase the total damage output by another 300,000 damage. This means it's going to allow us to compete in damage ballparks with other super combos like Curse of the Falling Star and of course Celestial Nighthawk. Now onto the exotic that's going to synergize the best with this build. It's fairly obvious if you're familiar with the Fallen Sunstar build that we're going to be taking advantage of Coldheart. Now I will admit, any arc weapon with synergizing capabilities like Volt Shot or standalone ionic trace spawning abilities is going to work here, like Delicate Tomb, Trinity Ghoul, or even Risk Runner if you guys are on a budget. However, in my opinion, Coldheart's exotic perk is going to be the best among them all, simply for this reason, where the longer we stay within its high damage state, the more ionic traces it's going to spawn, meaning we can farm our super and ability energy much more consistently. This combo alone is going to maximize the amount of ionic traces we can create, the only caveat being the double special nerf. But in my opinion, this is only going to hurt the build in high-end content like GMs or even the day one raid. I'll explain a little bit in better detail why when we get to the armor. But before we do that, let's talk about the subclass and go over all of our sources of ionic traces, because we're going to be creating a lot. And for starters, the abilities we want to use, of course, is Chaos Reach. Then for our melee, it's pretty much up to your choice. I like using Ball Lightning, but you could definitely sub in Chain Lightning if you want to use it. As for our grenade, we're going to be using Pulse Grenade. Now, depending on your preference, Pulse Grenade is going to be primarily used to spread as much jolt between enemies as possible because of how we can single out targets with it. This is going to come into play much more with our aspects and fragments, but if you want to change this out, another completely viable option is the Flashbang Grenade, because not only are they a shorter cooldown compared to pulse grenades, but they also apply the blinding debuff along with it, which means when paired with our first aspect, Electrostatic Mind, this allows us to create yet another source of ionic traces to farm ability energy. Speaking of, Electrostatic Mind is also the most important aspect in this build, because it causes all of our abilities and enemies affected by arc debuffs to spawn ionic traces, all while making ionic traces we pick up give us the amplified buff. That's where the argument of Flashbang Grenade over Pulse Grenade comes into play, because depending on your preference or difficulty of the content you're bringing this build into, there are slight pivots we can take to optimize this even further. A great example of this is the new Altars activity. I don't know about you guys, but the tier 3 version of that encounter just hurts. But when I started using Flashbang Grenade, it made the enemies a lot more manageable because they were CC'd for extended periods of time. Moving on over to our other aspect though, we're going to be using Arc Souls for various amounts of reasons. For starters, it allows us to create Arc Buddies for us and our allies that shoot enemies whenever we lay our rift. The real kicker here though is that these Arc Buddies are also considered Arc abilities, meaning they feed right back into creating Ionic Traces thanks to Electrostatic Mind. Pair that on top of our Coldheart and Ionic Traces will just straight up flood right in. Now as for the fragments, this is where we start to add on even more Ionic Traces. However, for the first fragment, we're going to want to prioritize at least some form of survivability in this build, and Spark of Resistance is going to be the answer for that. With it, whenever we stand near enemies, we're going to gain free damage resistance that stacks on top of our resilience and, other artifact effects when we use this build. As for the other fragments though, all three of these are directly focused around creating even more Ionic Traces. The first is Spark of Ions. This causes any jolted kills we get to spawn Ionic Traces. And you might be wondering right now, doesn't Electrostatic Mind already do that? And the answer to that is yes, but also no. You see, Electrostatic Mind does create Ionic Traces on jolt kills. However, it's its own instance, meaning when it procs, it will create its own Ionic Trace, and the same goes for Spark of Ions. Both of these work together to create their own instances of Ionic Traces, rather than speed up one individual proc of Ionic Traces. Now as for the other two sources of Ionic Traces, we're first using both Spark of Shock to make our grenade jolt on top of their current properties. In other words, our Pulse Grenade will jolt a wide variety of enemies, while our Flashbang Grenade will blind and jolt enemies. Then second, we're using Arc of Discharge to make arc weapon kills also spawn Ionic Traces. This will synergize with our Coldheart even more, so while we're in the high damage state, killing enemies will spawn an extra Ionic Trace on top of its exotic perk. Now before we get into the armor mods, let's quickly talk about what we can use in the artifact. However, I will say this build isn't heavily reliant on it, and honestly, it can be played completely without it. But with this Season of the Witch, we have the option of using the Elemental Orb system that came along with it. And of course, the first one we compare with this build is Elemental Orb's Arc. So our arc weapon kills can create an arc orb that will jolt enemies whenever we throw it at them. This will just function as an extra way to proc Spark of Ions and Electrostatic Mind, but all things considered, it's really just bonus. As for some other options we can use to improve the overall quality of life with this build, it's Divineer's discount to lower scav prices. This will help a lot with Coldheart especially, because if you remember here recently, Bungie did nerf double special, so for certain weapon combos like trace rifles, these will dramatically increase the amount of ammo we can pick up whenever we find a green brick. Now just to use up the rest of the remaining artifact slot, because there really isn't a whole lot we can spend, we can add on mods like Refreshing Pickups for more ability energy, Communal Pickups for extra weapon damage matching our subclass type, Elemental Fury for increased damage against champions, Monochromatic Maestro for bonus weapon and ability damage, and then Elemental Embrace so while we're amplified, we take stacking reduced arc damage that will not only stack with our resilience, but come especially in handy for the upcoming Day 1 Crota's End raid, because if you remember, both Wizards, Thralls, and Knights are all considered arc damage. Finally now though, with everything else out of the way, let's break down the mods that will be going into the armor. And for starters, before we get into breaking everything down, let's start out with the stats. And ideally, you guys want to focus everything into making sure you have 100 resilience and at most 7 intellect, because honestly, any more will not change the cooldown dramatically on your super, but if you really have the extra stats lying around, then you might as well push for 100. As for the rest of the stats, you can pretty much dump them wherever you want. I personally enjoy trying to push for 7 in discipline and then the rest into recovery. This gives me the most out of my cooldowns when it comes to my grenade and my rift, but depending on your preference, feel free to put it wherever you want. Now onto the armor itself, and starting over at the helmet, we're going to want to use a special ammo finder here so we can find as much ammo as possible for our Coldheart. If you're not using Coldheart, you could trade this out for something else. It's mostly just preference. Next to it though, we're going to be using a harmonic siphon. This is going to make our arc weapons create orbs of power, which we'll be using for both even more super energy and stacks of armor charge that we will use for later. As for the mod at the very end, I enjoy using a dynamo here to synergize with Spark of Resistance. So whenever we are in a situation where we are near enemies, we can use our Rift, gain Spark of Resistance, and a huge bump to our super energy along with creating Arc Souls. Again though, depending on your preference, you can change this out for something like Ashes to Assets. Both of these mods will get the exact same job done. Next up though, moving on over to the arms, and this is where we're going to be spending our stacks of armor charge on. We don't really need to invest super heavily into anything with the build ability wise, so here we can pretty much invest into 2 grenade kickstarts to gain our grenade as fast as possible, and in the long run feeding into our ionic trace generation. Now moving on over to the chest piece, and here all we're gonna need is 2 charged up mods. This is going to give us 5 stacks of armor charge at once and allow us to have our grenade kickstarts gain even more grenade energy when we use our grenade. Now on over to the boots, and this is probably the most important armor piece in the build. Starting on the left, we're going to be using an elemental charge. This is going to cause any subclass spawning resource to periodically give us armor charge stacks, and with how many ionic traces we're creating in this build, it's going to be our main source to gain stacks to spend on grenade kickstart. As for the mod next to it, it's an Arc Scavenger that was discounted thanks to Divineer's discount. This is mostly added extra, but in the long run, it's going to practically double the amount of special ammo we can gain through green bricks. Again, I want to point out that this will only impact the higher end section of the game where ammo is much more scarce, but all in all, it's still very useful. Now, as for the mod at the very end though, we're using a recuperation. This is going to cause orbs of power to heal us whenever we pick them up. This is going to be our main source of sustain with the build, because unlike other subclasses that have insane damage resistance or constant sources of healing, Arc really doesn't have that, so allowing orbs to fill that void is going to make this build feel so much more consistent. Finally though, moving on over to the bond, and realistically here we're only going to need 2 things. A Reaper mod to guarantee an orb of power after we use our Rift, and 2 bomber mods to feed right back into our grenade, playing more into the ability spam generation that we've already established. Overall though, I think that's gonna be it. I really think Chaos Reach is back, and I'm honestly super happy with the buff that they made to the big squeaky boots. Let me know what you guys think about the build. Do you like it? Is there any changes you would make to it? And if you have any questions, feel free to let me know down in the comments. I also stream over at Twitch almost every single day, starting either 12 p.m. or 7 p.m. Eastern, so feel free to drop by, and while you're at it, throw me a follow. There will also be a dim loadout link down in the description if you want to copy the build for yourself. But either way, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'm going to catch you in the next one. Bye bye.